Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, where we talk about all things fuel for all kinds of people. I'm your host, Eric Bjornstad, and I am your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. Now, this is the first in a series of shorter podcast segments where we wanted to kind of go back to school, if you will. Now, in the past, we've spent time digging into the details of some pretty big, broad, complicated subjects, like the different kinds of testing you might want to have done on your stored fuel, what those tests tell you, and what the results might mean from a practical standpoint. Now we want to go back to some of the basics, but do it in more shorter, more digestible chunks, which is why we're going to call these short episodes the Fuel Pulse Show Back to School. And so here we are, where we're going to kick things off by talking about the differences between today's ultra low sulfur diesel fuels, ULSD, versus the old school higher sulfur diesel fuels of the past. So to get started, we should go back about 35 years. Back around, let's say 1990, diesel fuel had a maximum sulfur content of about 5,000 parts per million. Then they passed Clean Air Act regulations that mandated by 1993 diesel fuel sulfur content had to be cut down to 500 ppm, a 90% reduction. That lasted until 2006, when they passed a further cut down to 15 parts per million. That means in a span of about just 15 years, they've reduced sulfur emissions by 99.7%, from 5,000 down to 15 ppm. And they did this because they knew that sulfur from the fuel is what primarily contributed to acid rain. So they're trying to do things to help improve pollution and air quality. So the diesel fuel they had before 1992, they called that high sulfur diesel, 5,000 ppm sulfur. The diesel fuel that was available between 1992 and 2007, that's called low sulfur diesel fuel, 500 ppm sulfur. And then the diesel fuel that we have now is ultra low sulfur diesel fuel, ULSD. It caps sulfur at 15 ppm. Practically, though, it's not 15 ppm straight from the refinery. The refinery generally produces it at around 4 to 6 ppm sulfur to start with. So when we ask what's different about diesel fuel today versus back then, the sulfur content's the first thing. And having that lower sulfur content affects ULSD in some other specific ways that also speak to how different it is now than before. So second big difference is that ultra low sulfur diesel has greater problems with water than diesel fuels of the past did. All diesel fuel, really all petroleum of any kind, has some amount of water. Now, the kind of water you typically worry about is that free water, the free water that collects on the bottom of a tank because it's heavier than the fuel. You also worry about emulsified water, which can be hard to get out. But all fuel also has dissolved water in it. That's the water that you can't see. Now, when they do the processing to remove the sulfur, they destroy some sulfur compounds that used to help repel the water in the fuel. These sulfur compounds would either absorb the water or they would bind with the water and make it separate out more easily from the fuel. But they're not there anymore. So that means the ULSD can hold more dissolved water than it used to. Now, why is that a problem? Well, because the amount of water that ULSD can dissolve, that goes up when the temperature is higher, and it goes down when the temperature cools down. In fact, fuel that's 100 degrees Fahrenheit can hold twice as much water as fuel that's 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So what's going to happen if this is a real-world storage tank situation is during the day, the fuel is going to get hot, and it's going to dissolve more water. Then at night, the temperature drops, the fuel temperature drops, cools down, and all that extra water drops out of the fuel because the fuel can't hold it anymore. And so you repeat that cycle day, night for weeks and months, and you're going to get a water phase building up on the bottom of that tank. And it doesn't take very long, honestly, for that water phase to become pretty substantial. So ULSD fuels have bigger water problems than diesel fuels in the past. And it's directly tied to removing the sulfur. The third big difference is virtually all the diesel fuel you come across has at least some biodiesel in it, between 2% and 5%. It's not labeled as such, but it's still in there because putting 2 or 3 or 5% bio into regular diesel fuel doesn't actually change any of the fuel specifications for the worse. In-spec diesel fuel with a little bit of bio added to it is still in-spec diesel fuel. And so they allow you to put 2 to 5% bio in diesel fuel without having to label that it's in there. Now, why do they do it? 2 reasons. For one, they're trying to get more renewable fuels like biodiesel into our national fuel supply, and that's in order to help satisfy the requirements of this law called the Renewable Fuels Standard. That mandates us to use X billions of gallons of renewable fuel per year across the country. So putting a little bit of bio into just about all the diesel fuel out there really helps in that regard. But beyond that, there's also the issue of lubricity, how well the fuel lubricates. Diesel fuels always served an additional function of lubricating fuel system parts like injectors and fuel pumps. And what they found was anytime you process that fuel and take out that sulfur at the refinery, it ends up destroying some of the compounds that helped with this lubrication. So what are you going to do? You can't have all these parts failing, right? Well, they also found that if you add just a little bit of biodiesel, 2% maybe, back into the fuel, it actually restores the lubricity rating of the ultra low sulfur diesel back to what it was before. So that's a good reason for putting that little bit of bio in there. And so they do. Fourth big difference is also related to dropping the sulfur levels. And that is the ultra low sulfur diesel today has a lower aromatic content than diesel fuel of the past. Now, to explain this, there's 2 big classes of molecules in petroleum fuels. There's aliphatics and there's aromatics. And when you reduce one kind, you by definition have to increase the other. Now, what's bad about aromatic hydrocarbons is when you burn them in an engine, they produce some of the primary components of smog and urban air pollution, and that's bad. So what the Clean Air Act did was that lowered the cap on the amount of aromatic content that diesel fuel was allowed to have because they're trying to make the fuel burn cleaner, so to speak. Now, when you take out the aromatic molecules and you replace them with aliphatic hydrocarbons, it is better for air pollution, but the negative trade-off is microbes love to be around aliphatic molecules. They much more prefer living in a place that has fewer aromatic molecules and more aliphatic ones. And so that means that when they mandated the fuel changes that they did, they may have helped air pollution, but they created a fuel blend that has much less resistance to microbial growth than the diesel fuels of the past. Fifth big difference between diesel fuel today and diesel fuel from the past is it's much less stable now than it was before. Now, this has a lot less to do with removing the sulfur than it does about having to do with the methods that the refineries use to squeeze more gasoline and more diesel fuel out of the crude oil in order to meet this ever-growing market demand. See, back in the 1970s, about 55 to 60% of each barrel of crude oil would be gasoline and diesel fuel, what they call the distillate fuels. Now it's 93%. Now, this helps the refineries stay profitable, but the gas and the diesel fuels that they produce have more unstable molecules in them. And these molecules are going to want to react and form these gums and varnishes and deposits. That's a substantial difference between the fuel that you have in your tanks now and the diesel fuels from 20 years ago. And then the last final big difference is ULSD is more susceptible to cold flow gelling in the winter. Now, if you're up north, you know that is something you have to think about every year. Now, how much of a change this really is depends on the fuel composition to an extent, but the kind of processing that they have to do to make ULSD has the unintended consequence of making the paraffins in the fuel crystallize and come out at higher temperatures than before. And that means ULSD gels at higher temperatures than it did before. So that's our dive into how diesel fuels have changed. Remember, they took out virtually all the sulfur from the diesel fuel. And while that has made it much better for the environment, the resulting fuel has more problems than before. It has more water problems. It develops microbial contamination a lot more easily. It's less stable, so it forms gums and varnishes more easily. And it has a higher cloud point and gelling temperatures than it used to. So those are all things to keep in mind as you manage your stored fuel in your tanks and engines. Thanks for joining me today for this back to school episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. If you like what you heard, feel free to subscribe so you don't miss any details. If you like what you heard, feel free to subscribe so you don't miss any updates. And leave us a review at your favorite podcast platform of choice. And we'll see you next time for the next episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.